welcome to Customs and Courtesies, the show that brings the history behind military customs to you. I am your host, Sergeant First Class Wellington Stirrup. In today's episode, I'm going to discuss with you the history and impact behind NATO as we celebrate its 75th birthday from this past week. So, sit back and enjoy the show. Hello, everybody that listens to the show. So, over the past couple of days, I've been reaching out to a couple of my friends, kind of discussing where I should start trying to take the podcast. And I've got a lot of good feedback from them. So, one of the things that one of my friends brought up is NATO and talking about its members and their contributions to it. And I think this is a great idea because this past week, I'm recording this very late on Sunday night of April 7th. So this past week, if you're listening to this tomorrow, it's Monday, which is why I'm saying this past week. But NATO celebrated its 75th birthday. So if you're not aware, the official birthday of NATO is April 4th, 1949. So that makes it 75 years old. And I think it's perfect timing that she suggested that I talk about NATO membership's contributions, not only the U.S., and not going into the very well-known GDP aspect of it, but some of the other things. And so over the next couple of weeks, I'm going to release more episodes talking about NATO members and their contributions outside of those, outside of the GDP aspect of it and kind of what they bring to the table. But for this episode, I just kind of wanted to highlight a couple of things, and it's going to be a rather quick one in my opinion. So I really hope you guys enjoy this and stick with me as we go through it. So let's get into this. Why was NATO established? Now, a lot of people think NATO was a entity that was established directly after World War II to prevent, another world war. And in theory, you could go with this, but it's wrong, right? When people think of NATO like that, they're thinking more of the League of Nations, which was established after World War I, and it was proposed by the United States, but then the United States, being isolationist at the time, decided they were not going to join in on the organization that they founded. I know, that's wild. Hey guys, I got a great idea. We should do this. And by we, I mean you. I'm out. Right? That's kind of what the League of Nations was. And so, of course, it collapsed and crumbled. And then World War II comes along and it happens. And people kind of take the idea of the League of Nations and they say, hey, we should kind of revamp this and we should look at this. And that is more or less how the UN was formed, not NATO. So, and I can talk about that, but that's not really like military history, but I guess it kind of has military involvement. So, custom, I guess? Question mark? I don't know. Anyways, getting off track. God, I gotta stop doing that. Why was NATO established? Well, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was established primarily as a collective defense alliance among Western European and North American countries during the Cold War. So that's when it started, was during the Cold War, which essentially did kind of kick off almost right after the events of World War II. A couple of years, right? About 3 years. But yeah, so they kicked off during the Cold War, and its main purpose was to provide mutual security against the threats of Soviet aggression and to promote stability and peace in the North Atlantic region. Now, I want you to keep an ear out for that one. Just keep that in the back of your head. Stability and peace in the North Atlantic region, because that plays a big role in the future part of this conversation, right? And we're going to get into that later. So just keep that in the back of the head. Stability and peace in the North Atlantic region. So, what significant events have happened under NATO? I'm going to give you a couple here, right? So there are several significant events that have occurred under NATO's auspices. Auspice? We're not going to get into English. 1, Cold War deterrence. So obviously NATO was established to deter Soviet aggression, right? So Cold War deterrence. NATO served as a deterrent against the Soviet aggression during the Cold War, maintaining stability in Europe and preventing large-scale conflicts. Now, if you are a student of military history, or you are in the military, or if you are an older veteran listening to this show, you will know the term LSCO, right? Large-scale combat operations. If you're a GWOT veteran, you got out before we made the switch back to LSCO environments, you may or may not, depending on your, how do I put it? Depending on when you got out, depending on the level of learning, I guess you could say, like devotion, I think would be the right term. The level of devotion that you put into studying, all the tactics. Because when I came in, and up until recently, up until about maybe 4 years ago, I never really heard the term LSCO, right? The acronym LSCO, the large scale combat operations. We learn about them, but we never actually learned the why. Like, we kind of go over like, hey, this event happened and this is the tactics that they used. And they never actually put the name to it. So when I actually was learning LSCO, I was like, oh, wait a minute. So like Desert Storm, when we mobilized all these units and pushed them here, and then, used this method to come down from the north instead of coming up through, beachhead assault, like that's LSCO. And they're like, yeah. And I'm like, oh, okay. So that was never really explained. And so if you're a GWOT veteran who's listening to this and you're like, wait a minute, LSCO, like what's that? It's been around. It's just never been properly explained to you. If you're kind of confused on it. Nothing wrong with that, right? But that is number one, why NATO wanted the significant events to deter and maintain stability in Europe and preventing LSCO, large-scale conflicts and operations. Number two of a significant event that happened in NATO history as we celebrate its 75th birthday is the Kosovo intervention. Now, Kosovo, if you are into the whole geopolitical atmosphere, they have some things currently going on in current events. So go ahead, check that out. A lot of stuff is starting to heat back up in the Kosovo area, right? Not only in Kosovo, but with Serbia and some of their surrounding neighbors. So the Kosovo intervention in 1999, NATO conducted a military intervention in Kosovo to stop the ethnic cleansing and violence, and marking its first major combat operation. So imagine you have an organization, and they've been around since 1949, and all they have done up until that point is train. So you can kind of get why people are like, what is the purpose of this? Because by 1999, Soviet Union is gone, right? They don't exist anymore. Well, your organization was meant to deter Soviet aggression. Well, there are no more Soviets. So what is going on? Oh, wait a minute. Now we have a genocide and ethnic cleansing going on in our region, and this is the perfect opportunity to showcase and display why our organization is still relevant. Boom. Right there. Right there. To stop the ethnic cleansing and violence. And it became NATO's first major combat operation. Number 3, the war in Afghanistan. Now, as an Afghan veteran, right, and as anybody who watched the events that unfolded, 2021, when we pulled out of Afghanistan, a lot of people have their opinions on that. We're going to keep the opinions out of it. We're just going to list the facts, right? Here are the facts. The war in Afghanistan sparked the first time that NATO invoked Article 5. So if you don't know about Article 5, it's think of it as the Three Musketeers, all for one, one for all type of deal. So that's Article 5, right? When one member of NATO is attacked, all members of NATO is attacked. So that was the first time that Article 5 was invoked in its entire history, right? So 1949, train. 1999, first major combat operation in Kosovo. 9/11, 2001, boom, Article 5. So we're seeing again, relevance. Why is this organization still relevant? Why is it still here? Boom. 9/11 happens, Article 5 invoked, everybody's mobilizing, right? So that led the terrorist attacks that happened, led up to the deployment of NATO forces to Afghanistan to combat terrorism and to support reconstruction efforts. Now, remember, peace and stability in the region. And now I want you to remember terrorism, right? Combating terrorism. So counterterrorism efforts. Keep those two things in the back of your head. Counterterrorism, peace and stability in the region. All right, moving on to number 4, expansion. NATO has expanded its membership multiple times since its inception, incorporating former Warsaw Pact countries and former Soviet republics, extending its reach and influence. Now, this is a topic that currently is on the hot seat. It has a lot of people's attention. A lot of people who are anti-NATO like to use this as to why Russia invaded Ukraine. And I will say that if you are one of those out there who thinks that this is why Russia invaded Ukraine because they felt like, NATO was getting too close to their borders, or you want to throw the argument out there that, we signed agreements saying that we would not expand NATO, I would say to you this. We did sign agreements saying that we wouldn't expand NATO any further than what the borders were at the time when we signed that agreement. And I want to say it was after the Soviet Union fell. I want to say it was either mid to late 90s that we said we wouldn't expand NATO. And you would be correct if you wanted to just go off of that. But here's the kicker. Russia also signed agreements saying that they wouldn't do certain things, and they broke those agreements. They broke those agreements multiple times, and I'll give you some hint, clues. So, a lot of Russia's nuclear capabilities, right? A lot of their nuclear assets were in Ukraine, and we signed an agreement between the three countries being the U.S., Russia, and Ukraine. Now, Ukraine wanted independence and they wanted protection. Again, they wanted their independence. They wanted to be recognized, not necessarily by the world, but by Russia as being independent. And they wanted protection. So they turned to the U.S. and they told Russia, they were like, hey, we will get rid of all of these nukes if you recognize our sovereignty. And Russia said, deal. because they had a lot of the nuclear capabilities that used to be a part of the Soviet Union. And so Russia was like, we should probably recognize their sovereignty because we're weak right now, right after the events of the Soviet Union. So their economy was in shambles, their military was in shambles. They were not in the place to try to boss anybody around. So they made that agreement with Ukraine. They signed the document saying they would recognize Ukraine's sovereignty. Now, the U.S. in turn said, yes, you will get rid of your nukes. They have agreed to recognize your sovereignty. And in return, we will guarantee you protection because you don't have the size of a military to be able to defend yourselves from them if they were to ever attack. You no longer have nuclear capability, which we like. So we will grant you our protection. And that is why today, in the year 2024, we have been providing them with aid to combat Russia because Russia broke that agreement. They broke that treaty. So it's only fitting that we do the bare minimum to help an ally. Another event that took place of, a show of Russian aggression and why NATO is still relevant and why there's membership growing is the events that took place in Georgia back in 2008. So every so often, countries petition to either join the EU or join NATO. And usually with joining the EU, people kind of look at that, if you're not already a NATO member, as, well, the next logical choice is to kind of look over to NATO and say, can we join you as well? Because we already have, our membership pending with the EU. So it would only make sense to tie our military to NATO. Now, the EU has its own military, kind of military standing. I'm not going to say standing as in like they have a standing army of itself. There are politicians within Europe who do want to stand up a EU military, like just an internal version of NATO without the US for political reasons, dealing with the elections and all that type of stuff. We're not going to get into that. What I will say is this, though. A lot of the EU members are NATO members, and a lot of NATO members are EU members. So they kind of look at it as, if you're vying for EU membership, you're probably also going to vie for, NATO membership, and vice versa. If you're a NATO member, you're probably already in the EU, or you're trying to get into the EU. So regardless, Georgia, 2008, Russia invades. What does that do? That caused a couple of the other countries to say, mainly countries that are around the border of Russia or used to be former Soviet countries, say, can we be a part of NATO? Because we would really like to not be back under Soviet rule, dictatorship, whatever it is, under Putin. Now, Putin will say that he's not trying to bring back the Soviet Union, but Putin has also gone out and said that he wants to restore Russia back to its, glorious standing of when Russia was at its strongest, which was during the Soviet Union. So, yeah, all day long you can say you're not trying to bring back the USSR, but you are trying to bring back the USSR's borders, strength, and domination over other countries. So, yeah. Also, 2008, what is little well known is Russia launched one of its first cyber attacks against a country. And that country was Estonia. Now, why is this significant and important? Because Estonia had just gone and tried to do what? Let's think about this. Estonia was one of the newer members of NATO. That's right. 4 years earlier, they joined NATO in 2004. So Russia invades Georgia in 2008. And at the same time, they were carrying out and conducting cyber operations against Estonia. And this is something that would play a big role in the events that took place in 2014. So that's a third thing I want you to keep in the back of your head. You have peace and stability in the region, right? You have counterterrorism, and now you have NATO expansion. Things are starting to add up as to why NATO is still relevant. So, without going even further into NATO expansion, big shout out, by the way, to our newest members of Finland and Sweden. Glad to see you guys with us. We're going to move on to counterterrorism. So this is the fifth significant thing, right? The fifth significant event under NATO, in NATO history, and that is counterterrorism. So NATO has increasingly focused on counterterrorism efforts, including intelligence sharing. That's a big one. Capacity building and military operations in various regions. Now, when it comes to intelligence sharing, this is something that I will be talking about in the future, primarily through the advice of some of my friends that I was talking to that I mentioned earlier. One of my friends, he's a former Kiwi signator, and he kind of suggested that I talk about Five Eyes, and my Canadian friend, she agreed, and so I'll be talking about Five Eyes and who they are, what they do. By the way, 3 of its 5 members are part of NATO, and through that, we share our intelligence. Obviously not going into anything classified or anything of that nature, but just the history behind it and its significance. So when it comes to counterterrorism, this, like I mentioned, this kind of kicked off during the GWAT time after the events of 9/11, combating Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Taliban, all of them going on in Afghanistan. And that is really where we see the counterterrorism thing kicking off. And then obviously, over the events or over the years since GWAT, since 9/11 kicked off, you had a lot of terrorist events happening throughout Europe. You had the subway bombing in England. You had the Manchester bombing at the concert in England. You had 2014 is still considered the bloodiest year in European history in regards to terrorism. All the events that took place, Paris, Brussels in 2014, those are the same events, I believe. Same group of people. They had made their way back to Belgium and got found. And you had the Charlie Hebdo attacks. So a lot of counterterrorism activity going on. And quick responses and, positive outcomes because they were stopped. Even though the events did happen, took place, and many people lost their lives, many more could have been lost if not for the intelligence sharing, if not for the practicing and being ready due to the events of 9/11 and the ongoing war in Afghanistan. So, that is something that is really big that we can actually credit that is a positive through tragedy. And what do I mean by that? I mean, the advancements that we have made in the realm of counterterrorism, they are only going to ever happen through tragedy, through something tragic. And that is something that the military in general always kind of learns. And there's a saying that I grew up with that my mom taught me at a very young age. And it's that the military is always fighting its last war. So if you don't understand what that means, it means, let's look at this. Let's look at it like this. When World War I kicked off, we still had people going into combat on horseback. We still had people, carrying swords into battle, at the same time getting mowed down by machine guns. Fast forward to World War II. The French build the Aginot Line, right? A wall of fortified defenses to stop the Germans from ever coming back through, mainly through the Ardennes Forest, which they did again. But this time around, the Germans hit them with aerial bombardment and then steamrolled over with the Blitzkrieg and tanks. The French were not prepared for this because the French were fighting the last war. They were fighting World War I. They were going off of what they knew. And that is what we do in the military. We go off of what we know, right? Historically speaking, this is what our enemy has done because this is what they just did 20-something years earlier. So we need to prepare for that. Now, we've gotten better. We try to project and think of what they might do. And this is now why we do war games and stuff like that. But even then, you're never going to fully know what your enemy is going to do because you're basing it off of the past. Historically speaking, this is how this army tries to fight. And this is what they might do. This is what they might do. That's what they might do. But you'll never know, right? So we learn through tragedy. And it's the same with counterterrorism. All the success stories that you can hear and read about and watch movies on or documentaries or, listen to, all those successes, they came out of tragedies. And so that's why I say, with the success of the counterterrorism that happens and takes the missions that happen and take place, they were born out of some tragedy that happened. Right? So like you might see a faster response time of a counterterrorism unit. Well, that fast response time is because probably, maybe 10 events earlier, there was a slow response time and a lot of people tragically lost their lives. So that's what I'm getting at. So that was number 5. Now, moving on to number 6, partnerships. NATO has developed partnerships with non-member countries and organizations to promote security cooperation, including through the Partnership for Peace program and cooperation with the European Union, right? There are European Union members that aren't NATO members, and we train with them. We partner up with them. We conduct exercises with them, and vice versa. And there are even members that aren't a part of NATO or a part of the EU that we partner with and conduct exercises with. Like, for instance, I think it was Armenia. Recently, the U.S. did an exercise with them. I think France also did an exercise with them, and maybe a couple other NATO countries. So, I believe it was Armenia. I don't believe it was Azerbaijan because I think they're still closely. Yeah, it was Armenia because they're starting to kind of pull away from Russian influence. So those are just a couple of events that highlight NATO's evolution and its role in addressing security challenges beyond its original Cold War mandate. Now that's important, right? Because I said that, right? Peace and stability in the region. And that extends beyond the mandate that to stop the, Soviet aggression, because there are no more Soviets. So now let's move into who are some of the strongest NATO countries. And like I said, I'm not really going to hit on the whole GDP thing. That's kind of a spoken agreement, the 2% of GDP. It's not like actually contractually bound, which is why a lot of countries, don't actually have to meet that. It's more of just a gentleman's handshake, as you will, an agreement amongst friends that, maybe we should try to hit this 2% mark. But without going further into that whole thing, let's get into who are considered to be some of the strongest members. Number one, obviously, the United States, because we spend a ridiculous amount of money on our military. And so, as the largest economy and the country with the most powerful military in the world, the United States plays a central role in NATO. Let me say that again. We play a central role in NATO, right? So it's crucial for us to, use our influence that we have to be able to benefit our organization, right? Especially the organization that came and answered the call in our darkest time, after the events of Pearl Harbor, our darkest time, aka 9/11. So, moving to number two, the United Kingdom, with a strong military tradition, advanced technology, and significant geopolitical influence. The UK is one of NATO's key members. Now, one might be wondering, its significant geopolitical influence, they're not an empire anymore. And I would say, well, dear chap, you're wrong. They are. They are still an empire, whether people want to believe it or not, because they have the Commonwealth. And while the Commonwealth, look it up, I believe it's 54 countries, and they all still recognize the monarchy as their sovereign. So while they are free countries and able to do things on their own free will, they still recognize, at the time when NATO was founded, it was still King George V, Queen Elizabeth's father, and then Queen Elizabeth for pretty much almost the entire time, up until now, King Charles. So, they still recognize him as their sovereign. They're not mandated to go to war if the UK is going to war, but they will answer the call if requested, right? So they don't have to go to war, but they most likely will give their backing and support through whatever means they can. And oh, by the way, if they are a Caribbean country, think of it like this. If they wanted to, because they are on the North American continent, shelf-wise, right? Now we're getting into some geology. If they're on a North American plate, they could apply for NATO. Just going to throw that out there. They could if they wanted to, if they're a Caribbean country and they're a part of the Commonwealth and all of that other stuff, because they're on a North American shelf. So, but yeah, UK still has a ton of massive influence because of the Commonwealth. And because of that, and their long-standing military traditions and their technological advancements, they are number two. Number three is France. France possesses a well-equipped military, including nuclear capabilities, and maintains an independent foreign policy while actively participating in NATO operations. Now, France is very much still active in Africa, and that is because they still have colonies. So before people want to get on me about, colonialism and all that stuff, France still has colonies. Don't look at me, just speaking the truth here. But they are still very much active all throughout Africa. And people can bash on the French all they want, but their military is very well trained. And oh, by the way, their military did hold off the Germans, not only in World War I, but in World War II as well. So, say what you will about the French waving their white flag and whatever, but those dudes can fight. If you don't believe me, just look at the stuff that they've had to deal with in Africa to help keep peace in that region. So, moving on to number four, the Germans. As the largest economy in Europe, Germany provides significant economic and logistical support to NATO, although its military capabilities have been traditionally constrained by its post-World War II policies. This is another big thing, right? So Germany is still kind of fighting with two hands behind their back. And before people get into comments or people try to, tell me whatever, that's the truth, right? But they still are a huge asset to NATO because they are Europe's largest economy and they're centrally located in Europe. So what does that mean? They're a hub. Boom. And being one of our allies, big allies, we have so many bases in Germany. It is ridiculous. So moving on to number 5, Turkey. Now, before we even dive down the Turkey rabbit hole, Turkey over the past couple of years has kind of been an off and on headache with NATO members. They shot down that one Russian helicopter the one time. They're kind of chummy sometimes with Russia. So, yeah, there are people out there who feel like Turkey should not be a member anymore. But Turkey's membership is very relevant. Turkey's strength is very powerful because Turkey is a strategic location. They control the Bosphorus Straits that pretty much keep the Russian fleet that's based in Crimea rather than making its way out to the Mediterranean if they wanted to. They have a lot of the nuclear capabilities there. A lot of our nukes, and I say our, I mean the US's, a lot of our nukes are based in Turkey. So, Turkey's relevance and membership is strategic, and it's, they're the only NATO member that is an Asian country because 99.9% of Turkey is in Asia, right? So they're the only NATO member that's in Asia. That projects our reach, NATO's reach, the US's reach to be able to carry out operations in Asia, aka part of the Middle East. And they also have, I think, the second largest military next to the United States of the NATO members. So, yeah. And they are battle tested because of the events going on in Syria, conducting operations, obviously, in Afghanistan, and I think they're in Iraq as well. And they're also moving out and branching out into like parts of Africa. So, yeah, go Turkey. Cool. And number 6, Italy. Italy contributes substantial military forces and hosts an important NATO bases, serving as key players in the Mediterranean security. So now are we starting to see how all of these places play a vital role in the peace and stability in the region? Because not only are we talking about Europe and its continent, but we're talking Asia, we're talking Northern Africa, we're talking the Med, right? So Mediterranean. Yeah. NATO plays a huge role. And these countries, among others in NATO, contribute to the alliance's collective defense capabilities and play vital roles in shaping its policies and operations. Now, one might ask, well, where's Canada? All right. Shouldn't they be in that top 6? And they didn't make the top 6, but Canada is generally viewed positively by other NATO members, and it is considered a reliable and capable ally within the alliance. Canada has a long history of active participation in NATO, NATO missions and operations, and demonstrating its commitment to collective defense and security operations. Canada's contributions to NATO include military deployments, peacekeeping missions, support for alliance initiatives. Its military capabilities, although smaller in comparison to some other NATO members, are highly regarded, particularly in areas such as special operations. Yeah, them boys are bad. Peacekeeping and disaster relief, right? So additionally, Canada's diplomatic efforts and commitment to promoting democratic values and international security are appreciated by other NATO members. Overall, Canada is seen as a valuable partner within the alliance, contributing to its collective security objectives while upholding shared values and principles. So, wrapping up, why is NATO still relevant in the 21st century? Well, you got a war going on in Ukraine, and because of that, multiple countries now who have historically been neutral in joining NATO are now NATO members, right? And that is because Russia, once again, has proven that they're not going to stop invading former Soviet countries. And they're, oh, by the way, making threats to NATO members who used to be Soviet countries that they want to try to invade them to bring them back into the fold. So why is it still relevant? Here's several reasons why. A collective defense. NATO's core mission of collective defense continues to be relevant in an era of evolving security challenges. It provides a framework for member states to deter and defend against potential aggression, ensuring security of its members. Article 5. Number 2, transnational threats. NATO has adapted to address emerging security threats such as terrorism, cyber attacks, and hybrid warfare. It serves as a platform for cooperation and coordination among member states to counter these transnational challenges effectively. Number 3, regional stability. NATO contributes to stability and security in the Euro-Atlantic region and beyond through partnerships, dialogue, and military presence. NATO helps prevent conflicts and promote peace in its area of responsibility. Say what you will about the organization, but it actually does, at its core, want to promote peace and stability, right? So number 4, interoperability and cooperation. NATO facilitates interoperability among its member states' armed forces, enabling them to work together seamlessly in joint operations and missions. It also fosters cooperation on defense capabilities development, procurement, and research and development. You would be surprised at how much technology stems not only from the U.S. military, but NATO members that you are now using every day without thinking about it, right? The internet started off as a R&D project for the military. GPS started off as R&D for the military, right? Those are just 2 examples that people use every day without thinking about. So, global partnerships. NATO maintains partnerships with non-member countries and international organizations, extending its reach and influence in addressing security challenges worldwide. These partnerships enhance NATO's ability to respond to crisis and promote international security cooperations. Number 6, democratic values. NATO is founded on shared democratic values, including individual liberty, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. It serves as a forum for like-minded nations to uphold and promote these values in an increasingly complex and contested international environment. So, overall, NATO's adaptability, commitment to collective security, and promotion of democratic values make it a relevant and vital alliance in the 21st century. And on that is why NATO is still relevant. And that is why I think going forward in the future, NATO is going to be one of, if not still, our biggest allies over here in the U.S., but an important key ally in the region of Europe, and just an important entity going forward in the future, right? NATO is important. NATO is relevant. And as it just celebrated its 75th birthday, kudos to NATO for still doing what it was established to do. And on that note, I'll leave you with this motto, which is NATO's motto. Now, I don't speak Latin, so if I mispronounce it, forgive me. But animus in consulendo. Consulendo. Liber. Right? So animus in consulendo liber. Or liber. I think it might be liber, which is Latin and translates to in counsel, freedom. And on that note, I hope you enjoyed the listen. Wherever you are, it's late for me. So good night, good morning, good day. Sergeant First Class Stirrup, signing off.